Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're based. I'm Tom Asher, representing Columbia World Projects here at Columbia University. And Columbia World Projects, for those who don't know, and I say this simply to ground you all, is an initiative of Columbia University that connects policymakers, practitioners, and researchers to explore pressing issues, including what sustains and ails liberal democracies around the world. There's a lot for us to do and talk about these days. Our plate is full. So this speaker series is supported by the Knight Foundation, and it's jointly organized by Columbia World Projects and the Center for Digital Governance at the Hertie School with our colleague Danny Stockman, who you'll hear from in just a minute. And together we address challenges generated by digital platforms for democratic institutions and discourse. So last month's really rich conversation in this series took place with Anu Bradford, a distinguished legal scholar here at Columbia University, who argued that competition policy does not necessarily stifle innovation, but rather the lending ecosystem that promotes new entrants into the market and the immigration system that allows or prohibits highly skilled tech workers is what really matters when seeking to foster an ecosystem that incentivizes innovation and business formation. If you missed it, I really recommend you go and seek it out on our website. And today we move from strength to strength. So we are so glad that you joined us today for what promises to be a really searching conversation. And at times, at least to my mind, a counterintuitive, but vitally important argument about how to regulate adaptive technologies, not least to AI, at a time when our policy toolkit that we're deploying is pretty bare from my mind. And that many of our most promising concepts, red teaming, providing researchers access to platform data, open source models to show the weights that algorithms use, are actually much more difficult to implement than we typically acknowledge, and they exist as frameworks more often than fully realized and implementable ideas. So today we're so fortunate that Danah Boyd's going to open this session by offering her thoughts on how we should design and govern digital platforms to stabilize and promote democratic discourse. And she does this all in reference to her latest work on interventions, not solutions, in the era of AI policymaking, which is a fantastic piece. Maybe Danah, you'll allow us to circulate it at the end of this presentation. But in any event, from here, I turn things over to Danny. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thanks everybody for joining us today. It is my great pleasure that I have the honor of introducing our speakers for today. Danah Boyd doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'll do it anyway. She is a partner researcher at Microsoft Research and an incoming professor of communication at Cornell University. And as most of you know, her research focuses on the intersection of technology and society, and then especially structural inequities. She's currently conducting a multi-year ethnographic study of the US Census to understand how data are made legitimate. So hopefully we're going to learn more about that in the future. Obviously one of the most known monograph of hers it's called It's Complicated: The Social Lives of Network Teens, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. Danah is going to lead us into a roughly 15-minute overview of her recent work and her thoughts about the question, how should we design and govern digital platforms to stabilize and promote democratic practice? And then Cavello will be giving her short 8 to 10 minutes remarks. After that, we'll follow with a roughly 5-minute response by Danah and open up to the broader room. And Cavello has also joining us for a while now. We're really delighted for her to come back and serve as a discussant today. She is the Director of Emerging Technologies at Aspen Digital, and is a technology and facilitation expert who is passionate about creating social change by empowering everyone to participate in technological and social governance. So I think her CV goes on and on and on. I could praise her more, but I don't think I should introduce you anymore. I think it's time for you to get us started. And so Danah, over to you. You have the floor, and then a follow-up by B. Thank you so much.
Thanks, and good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm excited to share this, and one thing I should warn you, I'm not ready to share this paper, but if you write me personally, I am very willing to share what I've been writing about. So just contact me. It's in the peer review process that doesn't get to be shared publicly yet. So the conversation I want to deal with is the fact that technologists and policymakers have a lot in common. both seek to find solutions to problems, and both also seek to really bend the future to their will. Among practitioners in both worlds, novel and innovative solutions are often valorized. However, this also means that both technologists and policymakers tend to fall into a whole range of traps of their own making. To make matters worse, policymakers tend to harden the solutionistic logics of technology industry in pursuit of supposedly regulating it, therefore concretizing the power rather than serving as a check to technology power. So in this line of work I'm working on, I'm really inviting people to listen to the way in which we are seeing the language being used, and to purposefully shift your orientation away from thinking in terms of solutionism in order to meaningfully challenge the existing arrangements of money and power that configure contemporary socio-technical systems. So rather than looking for solutions, I am going to argue that you should be looking for interventions. So an interventionist framework allows us to think more iteratively and non-deterministically about the future of AI. Okay, so let's start by identifying what we mean by determinism. Now, the concept of determinism can be really summed up by the notion of if X, then Y. And throughout history, theologians have struggled with the existence of God, and many philosophers have eschewed free will and taken a very deterministic stance. So a deterministic orientation towards human experience suggests that the future is preordained. At a more micro level, every action produces a knowable outcome. And so throughout history, engineers and technologists have actually pursued determinism within their own systems. And we can talk about the complexities of how technology and religion have sort of been entangled, especially regarding Christianity. But there's little recognition of the ecclesiastical roots of this orientation amongst technologists. Their mechanistic sensibility is because they're seeking a form of certainty, just like people who are seeking religious dreams of certainty are looking for. And as such, what we end up seeing is technologists want to ensure that if a person flicks a switch, the outcome is predictable, which is really lovely when we're talking about something as simple as flicking a switch. But modern day technologies are so much more complex in terms of the way they are structured as socio-technical systems. And this is especially true for the kinds of technologies that we're talking about in the world of AI, right? Because they're dealing with really unpredictable, messy social outcomes. So while many technologies that we can think of, even in the early days of the internet, are really designed to be deterministic, right? You know, click on a website, get the website you intended. What we're seeing with generative AI, of course, is these are designed to be intentionally non-deterministic. So it may be possible to read the code, you know, in an ideal situation where you had access, or to know what the data was trained on, again, in an ideal situation where we can not pay attention to the corporate structures around this. But even still, the power of generative AI stems from the ability to actually have these known things and come from the ability of producing complexity such that the output is probabilistic at every turn, literally word for word in a large language model. So even AI specialists who are so desperately seeking deterministic things often grapple with the conceptual and social consequences of building non-deterministic systems. They find this really baffling, which is where we start to see some of the artificial general intelligence types of stuff. So this rhetoric about how these systems are playing out is very much trapped in the dominant paradigm of the industry. So from the moment that ChatGPT was launched, technologists ended up shifting where their inevitability was coming from. Instead of being about what the outcome of the AI was, the inevitability was about the future with having AI in our hands. And so rather than being challenged, what we ended up seeing is that all of these journalists and academics and companies and policymakers all scrambled to jump onto this bandwagon that AI is inevitable and AI will change everything. And so instead of resisting this claim, we ended up buying into this claim, and we ended up repurposing a determinism not about the technology's specific outcomes, but about the societal implications of these technologies. So no, to be clear, there's a lot of power in propagating determinism using what Leonardi and Jackson referred to as a discourse of an inevitability to constrain a range of possible futures, right? Like that allows us to sort of push forward and do the kind of political acts we're often paying attention to. So of course, for those who come from an STS world, we can quickly look to the sort of classic social construction of technology, otherwise known as SCOT, And Scott scholars use historical case studies to describe the process by which new innovations emerge, get adopted, and become stabilized, right? And the canonical example in this world for biker was always the bicycle. And it was not actually inevitable that the standard bicycle would have, two wheels, that they would be the same size, a seat in the middle where the rider faces forward. There was a lot of what was referred to as interpretive flexibility in the development of that technology. But the creation of a standard bike was not determined by some abstract idea of what we think of as the best. Rather, a whole slew of competing actors struggled to make their vision into the dominant one. And so in the language of Scott, the end result of this is known as closure. And closure doesn't mean that there's no other type of bicycle, which we know there are, but rather that one approach dominates and sets the standard for others. And of course, this is one of the things we can appreciate about what's happening in the AI space right now, right? There is a lot of pressure at this moment to achieve closure, and who gets to achieve closure really matters. So we're currently in a moment of interpretive flexibility. But that doesn't mean that that's comfortable for people. In fact, the technologists and financial backers are highly incentivized to create closure around their system, their idea of the AI future that they want to see. And this is then how we see technological determinism plus inevitability rhetoric get shifted into a form of technological solutionism. Within this logic, we must have a technology to solve a problem. And of course, we will define the problem so that the technology we have can solve it. This has been the story of how the tech industry has sold new technologies for decades. So interestingly, Maria Angel and I spent a lot of time sort of struggling, with how policymakers were taking this one step further. And in particular, we wrote a paper sort of looking at the duty of care provisions that we see in a lot of bills related to children's online safety. And what we're finding is that the argument has shifted so that the technology has caused the problem. It's now necessary for the technologists to design their tools to fix the problem. This way of taking this one step further and forming a legally required solutionism, or what Maria and I call techno-legal solutionism. So solutionistic frames are rooted in all sorts of different systems, but they are part of the arrogance of determinism. So not only do they suggest the future is known, they suggest that a single policy or technology can create permanent closure around an issue. And in the process, such orientation fails to reckon with all effects that such policies or technologies create. So I want to offer an interventionist frame because it's significantly different. So think in the world of medicine. There's plenty of hubris amongst doctors, but the dominant contemporary paradigm in medicine is not oriented around solutions. Rather, since doctors operate probabilistically within a universe of uncertainty, they conduct interventions. Later, they follow up and evaluate the efficacy of a said intervention. Although they might make predictions about the outcome of a particular intervention, often to calm the nerves of the patient, doctors are excruciatingly aware of the side effects or other negative byproducts of their interventions. They take steps to minimize the negative outcomes, but they cannot ensure that their interventions will solve the problem. Medical interventions are evidence-based, but they are not deterministic. As a result, interventions must be evaluated, and from that, a doctor iterates. That is part of the mindset within. So in order to shift from a solutionistic orientation to an interventionist one, it might seem like a game of semantics, but it's actually forming a set of pathways that support new actions. Because an interventionist approach means embracing probabilistic models since certainty cannot be guaranteed. An intervention mindset also highlights the need for evaluation, since while there is a desired outcome, it's not clear that the intervention will achieve that. This mindset also invites the interventionist to account for the context. After all, one intervention might be effective when the conditions are best suited in a certain way, but might not work in another kind of context. And so one might intervene at different levels by trying to shape the condition for future interventions, right? Which is that we intervene in order to affect what will happen out on the outside. And then depending on that, we intervene again. And so being aware of this and seeing it as an iterative process rather than a solution really helps us be prepared for potential outcomes that are not what we hope for. So let's try to make this a little more concrete. So let's explore one commonly proposed solution to the governance of AI, which is the humans in the loop. This also sounds fantastic, right? But positioning humans where they are to decide and override an AI really has to depend on how that context is set up, because it's really likely that you could end up in what Madeline Ellish calls the moral crumple zone. Sorry, I warned everybody that I was sick before the call, but I didn't give you guys the warning. Sorry about this. All right.
Take your time.
Let's talk about moral crumple zones. So when Madeline was talking about moral crumple zones, she was interested in how people become in the loop just to absorb the liability of the whole system. So let's look at where this took place. So in the 1970s, Congress approved autopilot for aviation, but it required the pilots and co-pilots to stay in the cockpit just in case of an emergency. Now, today's pilots are glorified machine babysitters. So when the machine breaks down, the probability of them successfully landing is low, and the pilot error is often blamed when the systems break because the pilot was the last one touching the machine and the gear. Now, let's look at exception to this, because in many ways it tells us what's going on here. In 2009, Captain Sully successfully landed on an Airbus A320 on the Hudson River in New York, saving all 155 people who were on board. And so after taking off from LaGuardia, the engines on Sully's plane had ceased functioning because the plane flew into a flock of Canadian geese. Air traffic controllers instructed him to glide to Teterboro based on all of their models. But Sully refused. He argued that he would not make it. He was instructed to not attempt a water landing because of how difficult such a landing is. But because of his prior experience, he resisted the recommendations of the air traffic controllers. He prioritized his own expertise over told, knowing full well this was a violation of protocol. Because unlike most pilots, Captain Sully had experience flying without autopilot. In fact, he had a second job retraining commercial pilots how to fly in emergencies. He also knew the New York City region very well. The air traffic controllers were also quite experienced, and the strategies they used to support pilots are also well honed, full of expertise. But neither Sully nor the air traffic controllers had complete information. Captain Sully was more confident in his ability to land on the Hudson to go to Teterboro based on his. So after his near-perfect landing in the Hudson, an investigation began, and Sully was, of course, required to participate in it. Through the process, it became clear that the models used by air traffic control really did not account for new construction in New Jersey. So Flight 1549 would have not made it to Teterboro, would have landed into new construction in New Jersey. Sully, though, argued during this sort of investigation that his ability or his inability to override key systems in this on the plane meant that he had all sorts of other consequences. So in put another way, he thought he would have 5 extra minutes to save people if he had been left alone. Now, this is this interesting moment because you see how technologies have already been created to resist what it is that pilots could do to override them, which of course we would see later on with the Boeing Max 8. So as we are painfully watching in real time right now, aviation is breaking down. Over decades, we've added AI into planes, air traffic control, and the construction of airplanes. We are now at a point where we're saying, oh, we don't really need air traffic controllers, so let's fire them all. And we've actually created a system where we didn't just put humans in the loop temporarily, but we created.
As well.
Ooh,
Do
somebody just turned themselves off mute.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you so much for.
All right. And so what we've ended up doing is we've ended up disempowering the people in those loops, right? So we end up putting more pressure on them, more expectation, less opportunity, and massive amounts of disempowerment. These people are de-skilled on the job. They have no opportunity to actually gain status like they once had. And so the humans in the loop as a strategy only works when the incentives, skills, and structures are properly aligned. So when humans are put into the loop on an AI system, they end up being there, not really to help deal with what's going on there, but in many ways to absorb the liability or to uphold the mirage that everything can be artificial in its intelligence. So, of course, we've heard in different ways how humans are the undervalued ghost workers. And more supposed AI systems are rolling out with humans doing all sorts of invisible labor behind the scenes. Humans are expected to override risk assessment scores, but they're politically disempowered to do so. And this is sort of brought on in context of things like what we're seeing in terms of judicial decision making, where judges are expected to override, except that they have no political reason to do so. And in fact, if they do override, they end up getting all sorts of challenge in terms of their own ability to get elected the next time. So rather than thinking in terms of humans in the loop, we need to be focused on how to properly construct an arrangement of people and technologies so the system degradation does not result in a form of accident. Right? This requires accounting for the maintenance and the repair, as well as looking for the vulnerabilities in the system. After all, left alone, infrastructures will break down. So now, a new technology is not inherently disruptive. And the sun is coming up. A new technology is not inherently disruptive. In fact, in many ways, disruption is a chess move. It is disruptive if and when it's placed into an environment in a manner that benefits some people over another. So the reason why technology industry valorizes disruption and disruptive technologies is because venture capitalists and well-funded companies are well poised to capitalize on these disruptions, right? And we're also seeing, of course, what happens when that reaches the level of government status, right? Where governments are at the point where they can actually capitalize on massive disruptions, or of course, business people can, for example, capitalize on whether or not we're going to go into a tariff war. So, one of the things to think about in terms of how this comes to being is brings us to Manuel Castells, right? Who's a sociologist who was very much interested in how we think about power as it operates within networks. And he argues that the most powerful actors are those who can arrange the networks of people, institutions, and flows of information and money to their advantage. So technologists can be introduced in a manner, or technologies can be introduced in a manner that disrupts existing technologies to their advantage. All right. So those who are prepared for disruptions are really equipped to respond to them strategically. Leveraging disruption can actually be quite lucrative. Not only is there money to be made on placing the right bets, but companies who are poised to leverage disruption can push for closure before the competitors are able to take action. Because laws have the potential to hamper the gains from disruption, it behooves those invested in disruption to enroll policymakers into their project. And this is a key lesson that the technology industry derived from Larry Lessig's argument. The code is power, if and only if the market, the social norms, and the law do not serve as a counterweight. So the key here, of course, is if you're trying to do disruption, you want to arrange the market, the social norms, and the law to your advantage. As we look to the emergent fights over AI, we need to keep our eyes wide open. This is not simply a technical debate. What we are watching is a strategic arrangement of actors and mechanisms to define a certain future as inevitable. And when we play into this inevitability rhetoric by critiquing it, by saying, oh, we need to all prepare for this future AI, then in many ways we repeat the technology industry's deterministic orientation. And even when we argue that everything is bad, we end up doing a disservice to this process. We don't end up actually challenging it. We end up repeating it and creating an us versus them, both marching in parallel toward an AI inevitable future. Instead, it really behooves us to resist closure, to eschew determinism, and to eradicate solution from our discussions of technology. After all, most of us know the future is not preordained. It's really up to us to determine how to define it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danah, to share not only your thoughts, but also your voice with us. Really appreciate it. And now B. Cavello is going to give their comments. B.
Thanks, Danah. Thanks, Danny. It's a pleasure to join you all. I'm B. Cavello. As mentioned, I lead the emerging tech team at the Aspen Institute and the Aspen Digital program. And I confess I got to see a sneak peek of Danah's article, which I'm very excited to come out So thank you so much for sharing these remarks. And I may also pull on a couple of threads that didn't come up in the discussion yet, but I would love to hear a little bit more on. One, I just want to like quick aside. You mentioned the kind of like religious determinism of the tech industry, and there's a great scholar and YouTuber called Religion for Breakfast that did a really fun kind of exploration of religious motifs, and particularly apocalyptic motifs in the AI community that I think is worth a watch. But it is interesting how in the policy space, you mentioned that there is this, very intentionally non-deterministic AI system that is being built. And at the same time, kind of almost in an act of, I don't know, maybe great humility, the people in the system assume that the humans are the more deterministic element, right? That the way that people are going to react to social media is somehow more predictable than the technology itself, which I think is really interesting. But at the same time, it seems like this belief about how determined and how predictable people's reactions and behaviors will be often means that we miss out on the kind of evaluation steps and the feedback loops that are needed in the policy process. So prior to this role, I had the pleasure of serving as a Tech Congress Fellow working in Senator Wyden's office in the year 2021. And one of the things that really shocked me when I arrived on the Hill was the phrase evidence-based policymaking as this new and exciting thing people were doing. And I was like, what have we been doing the rest of the time? So I think it's really interesting that we lack often a baseline, before our policy interventions. We don't have the annual checkups in your doctor analogy to even compare against to know when we intervene in a system, what is changing. And I think that that's really important as we think about policy as an intervention tool, because while I agree around this goal of kind of moving past the solution as headspace, I also think that, in practice, policy often doesn't just have this deterministic view, it often lacks foresight. One of the things that I encountered a lot of was people writing bills or proposing policy interventions that seem to assume just like one therefore down the road. So, you put in place an intervention, people react, the ecosystem reacts. There were so many bills written about, for instance, social media companies that just assumed that they would continue to operate in the same ways that they had, but with the new law in place. When in reality, we know that humans and our societies are incredibly adaptive. And with new rules in place and new structures to adapt around, new formations will take place. And so one of the things that I found to be helpful in this process is an activity inspired by a childhood book that I read called Fortunately, Unfortunately, which has this kind of story of this kid trying to make it to a birthday party, but all of the twists and turns every time you turn a page, there's a new, fortunately, he was able to get in the airplane. Unfortunately, the airplane broke down. Fortunately, he had a parachute. And I think that that sort of framing can be really helpful for trying to think a little bit further ahead as we anticipate policy processes while recognizing that these systems are non-deterministic. I also think that there's some really interesting questions around how evaluations fit into these ecosystems. So a sneak peek to share that I'd love to hear a little bit more from you on, Danah, is the role of red teaming and some of these other evaluation tools that are in our toolkit. There is, I think, a growing movement toward trying to actually measure and understand what happens when we deploy AI into different environments. And I think that one part of that is understanding how AI systems will respond to different prompts or different applications. But I think another big piece of that is looking at the whole process, the human process that we're introducing these technologies into. Those of you who spoke to me when I was working in Congress know I was deeply invested in the Algorithmic Accountability Act, and in particular, really thinking through what does it mean to have algorithmic accountability when we recognize that the spaces in which algorithms are being deployed and used are spaces of human consequence. And so one of the ways that we framed our work in the Algorithmic Accountability Act was really centered on the idea that we should not be focused on the tech, but rather be focused on the decision system that is taking place. And obviously we were focused on decision-making spaces. A lot of generative AI is kind of in a mixture of environments. So I think that there's definitely room for update. But I think that there is something really valuable about zooming out a little bit and saying, how does this thing interact in the human system in which it's being deployed? I'll finish with one more remark that I'd love your thoughts on, Dana, because I think that you've been really thoughtful about like where these things actually interface with the world, right? How is it that people are thinking about these tools? How is it that people are using these tools, and what does that mean for the decision-making systems and the organizations of humans that we operate within? At the same time, I'm also curious to look a little bit upstream. So while a lot, I think, of the AI community is focused right now in a very legitimate way, right? Like I 1000% agree, you know, in Algorithmic Accountability Act, for instance, we were really focused on this impact assessment process and what does it mean to like look at these effects of introducing an intervention and seeing what happens. At the same time, I think that more of this community could be looking upstream at what goals we're actually aspiring toward in the first place. You opened talking about the kind of determinism and this sort of godlike role that AI developers often kind of claim to play in building these incredibly complex systems. But at the same time, I think that too often we lean into this idea around general intelligence as this North Star, and not only do, you know, of course, machine learning developers pursue this thing that I personally am not a big fan of, but also I think that the policy community also assumes that that is the direction that AI must be headed in. And I think that there's a real opportunity, and I love this paper. It's probably an archive link now on how to stop treating AGI as the North Star of AI research. But I think that we can be asking more pointed questions about what AI systems are built and designed to do. And one of the things, self-plug, that I'm going to throw in at the end here is I think that there's a real opportunity for us in this community who care about these impacts, who care about the ways that humans interact with them, to actually set the goals of AI research and say, yes, we are going to measure the impacts. We are going to look at how these systems operate. We are going to look at how people interact with these tools and those interfaces. And also, we're going to create better challenges for this AI development community to rise to, because I think that there are really exciting challenges that we could set. Like, I work in this space because I think tech can be really helpful. But at the same time, I think that we need better measurements of what success looks like, and we need better metrics. And so I'm really excited for this community to develop greater benchmarks for AI systems that are actually in line with what we as humanity want to see for the world.
Thank you so much, B. I really appreciate it. You know, my first thing I want to pick on, because I have to admit, I was very, very confused by evidence-based policymaking as well. I was like, what the heck are you guys talking about? And what I quickly realized in talking with some of the people behind the scenes on this is how much this was about creating a mirage that, like, we're going to make it all neutral. And that's how we're going to get out of the political morass that we're in, is we're just going to make it so that we are doing this based on neutral data. And that for me was part of what led me to a lot of the census work, where I'm just like, this data is all constructed all the way down. What are you talking about? And I started to realize that we're actually dealing with different epistemologies, right? Epistemology being the way we know what we know. And there's this huge history of ways in which epistemology, you know, creates these different kinds of ways of hiding what you're actually doing. And so one of my favorite sort of fun historical pieces that I'll give here has to do with the 1920 census, just because I find this fascinating. So it turns out that the census collected the 1920 census like it had done in previous decades. There were a few extra quirks that year because of a pandemic. But, you know, by and large, they managed to successfully collect the data. And for all intents and purposes, the quality was no different than it was in previous decades. But leading up to that, a bunch of technocratic folks were like, you know what? We are going to make the process of reallocating political representatives in the US to be like a non-political activity. We're going to make it completely neutral. And the way that we're going to do this is that we're going to determine the number of representatives ahead of time and exactly the algorithm that we're going to use ahead of time. Now, what's notable here is that up until the 1920 census, the way that the Congress decided to reallocate its representatives was looking around at its peers and being like, well, which states are going to gain more seats? So we don't want to lose any of our colleagues. So we'll just give extra seats to those places. It was truly funny math, right? Like funny math that would make anybody's hair, sort of go gray. And so instead, what they did is they're like, okay, well, we're going to do this ahead of time. Well, that wreaked chaos. And the result is that when the census gave the data to Congress in January of 1921, there was all these different fights that were happening about where the political representation was going to land and like who would be, sort of affected, because it hadn't been a zero-sum game before. It had been sort of altered that way. And so the result is you end up with this warring fight between economists about the right way to do math. In the end, Congress and particularly the Southern Democrats leveraged that mayhem to say we can't possibly reapportion Congress until we figure out the right math. And they never reallocated, right? And it wasn't until 1929, at which point they were like, we need to cement this permanently so this can't be done, which is why they handed the power to reapportion over to the president, which in the 2020 census was its own threat. So I say this because it's throughout history when it comes to certain kinds of policy work, there's these different efforts to try to make things neutral, to try to make things apolitical. And so when I look at the evidence-based policymaking, all I can think about, because so much of it was actually about climate, was this is a way of hiding politics so that people could do their own research, right? And we're actually seeing the worst of this right now. And this is what's happening, of course, in terms of medical, research, where we're seeing a political environment where we have the head of Health and Human Services saying, well, we're going to listen to all of the science, not just the approved science, right? And you're like, oh my goodness, this is where we're at, right? So this is where we're starting to see, things that have been about different epistemic fights about how to build knowledge, and we're seeing alternate views being used under the framework of evidence, so that you can actually say some things can be known, some things can't be known. And remember that we live in a political context where we're not even allowed to collect data about gun violence, right? How many people die due to gun violence? So this has been a form of political fight. What is evidence? What is allowed to be known? What is not allowed to be known? For those who aren't familiar with the literature on agnotology, it's like one of my favorites. So agnotology is the study of ignorance. So if you think of epistemology as the study of science or study of knowledge, agnotology is the study of ignorance. And the academic field that's sort of working around this argues that there's three kinds of ignorance, right? There's that which is not yet known, which we can think of as science, but we can also think of it at a local level of like the kid who doesn't know how to tie their shoelaces yet because they haven't yet learned, right? So this is like not yet known. Then there's the knowledge that is lost or forgotten or destroyed as a second category. And again, at the macro level, you can think about this as knowledge of indigenous populations that's lost due to genocide. And at the micro level, you can think about it as like the dude who knew how the copier worked inside the organization, and now he's left and nobody can figure out how the copier works, right? Like that kind of stuff. And then the third category of ignorance is that which is polluted or destroyed in terms of knowledge, right? And this is where you get conversations about mis and disinformation, but you also get destabilization as a political project, right, at a macro level. So I think that's important because, of course, these are all feeding into this conversation about these systems. And this is where I'll come to next to the red teaming bit. So red teaming is interesting because it is a marriage of, a set of security rhetoric, right? We all know red teaming from a cybersecurity space. So there's a very specific set of lineages there. And what was happening in content moderation, which was low status within technology companies. So it was easier to pick up on the rhetoric from the security, which, at the present is seen as much higher status. Notably, it was not historically, right? Security was a joke 40 years ago. There's great case studies of how that became a profession. Content moderation, though, is, of course, politically fraught. So so red teaming is this marriage of both of them, of saying, like, what happens when, a system is sort of, spewing all sorts of things that are called hallucinations. I think it's better to call them bullshit. And like, how do you actually deal with what does the system know, what it doesn't know? My colleague Cooper has often been really interested in, the current solution to that in the AI space, which is also often about unlearning. Although I like his argument that this is actually a form of lobotomizing, technologies due to their hysteria. And I mean both of those words with their highly gendered historical past, right? Which is notable because of the ways in which, when we lobotomize, we don't just actually erase things in the past, we create all sorts of ripple effects. And so this dynamic right now of like, okay, you can start to find the vulnerabilities in these systems, but where along the system do you start to back up? And so what does it mean to be able to find where the system goes rogue in different ways? And what does it mean to intervene? Like, how much are you constraining it? What are you trying to get it to do? And how does each move create other sorts of ripple effects? And I often think about this in some of the AI systems that we've thought about earlier, for example, search engines. People have tried to algorithmically solve the search engine, dynamic for years. And it's like, it turned into a Frankenstein monster in many ways. And I often think back to the original, original paper that the co-founders of Google wrote, Brit and Page. They wrote this paper that they were like, we have finally found the solution to this whole spam on the internet problem. We have found the perfect algorithm that will make sure that, always the best things come up to the top. And you're like, oh my gosh, guys, like really? Right? Because of course they've had to build, decades, constant patches and patches and patches. And they've created new vulnerabilities with each and every turn. And this is one of the reasons I do believe, I'll conclude and then we'll go to other questions or B, if you've got follow-ups. There's sort of an interesting element here about like, how can we learn from different aspects of the security space? And the reason I say this, having spent time like thinking about search engine security, but also more broadly, the thing that there's a mindset in security that I relish is that a system is never secure. It's never foolproof. It's never done. In fact, security is a constantly evolving process as everybody is doing a dance in relationship to one another. Each intervention results in all sorts of other ripple effects, and people have to respond to that and react. And I really think that there's something to be said about how we approach this right now as a form of socio-technical security, which is to say that we can't just look at the system. It's not just about unwarranted access, but we have to look to your broader point about what are the broader decision-making processes? What are the broader systems that we can be accounting for? And how do we not just think about securing a system, but securing a whole set of structures and social systems at play? So it looks very different when you actually have, like for example, when you're paying people to actually produce content in a stabilized fashion, it looks very different than when you're using it as an extractive tool, right? Like those are very different environments. And the environment really matters because of the long-term, goals and desires of all of this. Anyhow, just a few random thoughts to your comments, B, but they're fascinating thoughts. And I don't know if you want to follow up or if we're going elsewhere. Another plan.
So Tom is going to lead us over into the Q&A mostly so that I can ask some questions. Tom, over to you.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for an extraordinary set of both presentations and a terrific back and forth. I was a fan before. I'm now a super fan. If you're selling tokens or crypto coins, I'm a buyer. So please, if you would come onto the camera, that would be great. Come onto the screen, that is. Raise your hand just as Joanna has done. And Joanna had a lively back and forth on the chat. And I think for now we'll bring it into the conversation. Please, Joanna.
Sorry, I was actually just looking for a book that was relevant to something you just said. Which is, because I'm so bad with names. It's Guardrails is the book, and Urs Gasser is one of the authors, and I keep forgetting the other guy's name, Vincent something. But somebody in the chat said the thing about the more perfect union, this constant striving for improvement, which those guys who wrote Guardrails were talking about how AI people get wrapped up in this idea that, oh, we can fully automate the law and then we'll lock it down and there won't be misapplications of the law. And they're misunderstanding the fact that the whole point of the law is that you're constantly trying to improve. And this is why it's such a great idea to recognize and acknowledge that AI is a product of industry, and as such, it's subject to product law. And therefore, it is constantly, so how product law works is that you have to do due diligence. What is due diligence? The sector itself determines that. It is the standard. It says, And the people who are in the lead, so actually, if you're a new company and you're small, you're actually allowed to play more fast and loose. But if you get over a certain threshold of market dominance, then you're obliged to follow best practice. And so that's the kind of thing that a lot of us in a lot of countries have already understood. And so the main thing that I think is the main theme, that was the most recent conversation on the side. The main theme for me on the side was that, well, I absolutely love the beautiful poetry of what Danah and Bea were saying. I had a real problem with the fact that they were amplifying exactly the wrong policymakers. There has been hundreds, thousands of people putting years and decades of effort into coming up with incredibly sensible digital governance. It exists in the EU, it exists in China, it exists in Brazil, it exists in Australia, right? It sort of exists in the UK. It's getting compromised. I don't know. So, but there is good stuff that is out there, and it isn't that we're all talking about AGI like it still exists or makes any kind of coherent sense. And we're, so I think it's really important if you want to achieve the goals that you're talking about, that you acknowledge and amplify anyone, anywhere. Costa Rica is actually, UNESCO, the UNESCO AI recommendation on AI ethics, it's unfortunately non-binding because of 4 countries: China, Singapore, the UK, and I forget the last one. Oh well, 4 countries made it non-binding. Russia, of course. Sorry, how could I forget? Right. So 4 countries made it non-binding, but nevertheless, it is a recommendation. Therefore, everybody has to talk about what they do in light of that. It's completely sensible. And I think those were the guys that recently figured out that Costa Rica is one of the world leading people in this kind of stuff. So there are perfectly sensible things out there, and we need to amplify those. And yes, there's a lot of real garbage and real nonsense. And there's a lot of money behind that nonsense that's getting pumped into efforts to tear down this other stuff. And that's why when people are here in the context doing great work, I really wish that they would use some of their platform to amplify and build momentum behind the successes that are out there too. So that was my comment on the side. So
should we take a couple comments and then go back to the two of you? Danny.
Yeah, thank you. So my understanding was that I think Danah's point was mostly about an attitude change. So it was less about amplification or who to amplify. But you should speak for yourself. But it was more about arguing in favor of a more general attitude change. And I think you made that point really very convincingly. What I was wondering about, Danah, can you talk a bit more about the direction or sort of the vision of interventionism? Because sort of one of the comments or points you made was that, so for example, one intervention could be in order to establish the conditions for another intervention, which would then require some sort of success matrix in order to define whether the intervention is actually leading to the desired outcome, right? But doesn't that also require us to think more about a broad-term vision of where we want to be in the long term so that we can connect these individual interventionist or interventions to a meaningful policy change?
Do you want to answer
So
these two
respond
and
now
then
for
we'll...
Ira.
Okay, Ira,
Yeah, I mean,
come
for
on
me, yeah, I think. Oh, go ahead, Ira.
No, why don't you go ahead and then I'll come in.
So I think that the important thing, I think Danah is right, and so I'm really thinking about a mindset. I'm not specifically thinking about specific policies, and that mindset for me isn't just about policy as dictated by specific states, but it's policy even at the much more local level in terms of how people are organizing and interacting with the technologies. They're adopting them into organizations as the solution, and that is a problem. Because then they're surprised that it doesn't work as they expected, with journalists, as I mentioned, who are also doing this. And so one of the things that I think is important about interventions is that it's not that you have a pre-understanding of like the outcome you want, right? We can all talk abstractly about we want a healthier and happier society and all of these other things. That's all fine and well. But in many ways, it's taking something that's actually rooted also in computer science, which is that on day one of, my first day of computer science courses, we talked about extensibility. We talked about the importance that you had of like building code that you could build on, right? And that, this is one of the reasons you have to learn to comment your code from the beginning, which of course we're all terrible at. But it is also one of the reasons when I think about interventions, a lot of what you end up doing is you build in structures so that you can evaluate or deal with the system later on. You make certain that you have those hooks onto the system that will work. And we can think of this in other domains, right? Like, one of the things that's interesting about the requirement of a financial audit in a financial space is not as much the outcome of the audit, but all of the structures that are put in place to make an audit possible. And that in itself often does a lot of the good work that we think of as getting to the audit, is building those structures. Likewise, when we think about what, the way that, the medical establishment work, you're looking for baselines, right? You're looking for baselines that you do comparatively. So you can see how systems have changed based on choices and actions. And so this is why, for me, this mindset shift is really important, because it's also just a way of getting people to be building around the system, to ask the questions. Like, if your organization, for example, wants to get, more efficiency because you put AI in the system, how are you even measuring efficiency? Like, do you have a measure for that? Does that even make sense? Does productivity have a measure for you, right? Because you're going to do this massive thing under the promise of this, change. And like, at one point, B was asking, about, on the ground behaviors, because, of course, they're right that I spend way too much time thinking about on the ground stuff. And one of the things that's so fascinating to me is watching, AI roll out, right, is that people like, this will one day pay off for the thing that I'm trying to do, which is why I'm going to invest an obscene amount of time and money and energy fighting this system. And I'm fascinated about how much longer it continues to take people on so many kinds of tasks. There are tasks for which it is very phenomenal. And then there are other tasks where you're like, oh boy, like you're going to spend your entire life just trying desperately to get the system to behave the way you want it to, because it does not work for that task. So this is why, for me, it's not just about, trying to think about the actual development of a particular model, but like the way in which we actually deploy or think about these systems holistically. And are we building in the ways, not just to evaluate them, but to be able to iterate and evolve with them? Because one of the problems, of course, with a lot of these AI systems is that, no organization is paying the true cost of what these things right now actually cost, right? The environmental cost, the machine cost. Of course, we're going to fight with the global tariff cost. So what does it mean when this is no longer backed by hopeful, wishful dreams? Is this worth the cost for each of these tasks? And like, that's the other thing, is organizations need to have rubrics to be able to understand that before they can even implement it within their own space. B, did you want to respond at all?
So much to say, but I also know there's other folks who had a hand up. So why don't we go to Ira and then we can jump in.
So my question goes back to the very beginning of the frame, Dana, about the contrast between determination and intervention. And it seems to me, I would ask the question this way, not whether there are alternatives, but how we think about the relationship between them. And I think about determination at least as spanning three alternatives on a kind of simple-minded continuum. You can say, as you began by saying, if A, then B, that in the sense that if A, always B. That's a very strong and simple version of determination. There's a very weak version, which is if A, B becomes possible. A is a necessary condition. But then there's the most interesting one, which comes closest, seems to me, the notion of intervention. If A, then B becomes possible. And then the question is, under what conditions does that possibility get realized? And what are the effects, or what are the configuration of elements required to gain the possibility which is desired by the intervention? So my takeaway from this very interesting presentation is to work harder about thinking about the relationship of intervention, causality, and configuration of elements that would lead to successful interventions. It's an abstract point, but you invited it, so.
No, and I think you're entirely right. I mean, and this is part of what I love about, the field of science and technology studies is that it really forces us to think about, socio-technical arrangements, not just inevitabilities. And we've seen this throughout the history of that field. And in many ways, I also think it's one of the reasons why, when I go back to the philosophical fights over determinism, we also quickly get into religious, histories here, right? And, coming from a more Jewish tradition, like one of the things, of course, is you don't just interpret any biblical text as necessarily like only having one interpretation. That's like beyond comprehension within a Jewish tradition, because of course the interpretations are the Talmudic debates forever. Versus other religious traditions that are like, there is one interpretation. You're like, oh gosh, right? And so like I find this is also really where we start to get some of these mindset issues, and we get the deep devout determinism comes from a very Christian tradition, and I find that is one of the things, one of also just been exploring is the degree to which we have different forms of nouveau Christianity also shaping the kinds of logics of the tech industry right now, which I think is one of those understudied, understood things. But again, if you're letting me go tangent, I will go tangent too. But part of why I point this is that I think that we have to deal with how we are embracing these different philosophies, and so much of the AGI fight right now is a philosophical fight. Right? It is an ideological, it is a religious fight that is about different kinds of futures. And I think that when we go with that really, 30,000 foot version, we start to see why we're struggling to debate, because when we can't agree on the philosophy of what is, human life, what is the role that we are playing within this world, then we debate down here on little micro things, but we're not actually dealing with the same macro picture, right? And so I think that, that component piece of just like, we want A to be in place so that we can create possible futures that include all sorts of things that are possible with A. And that the thing that we want in this world doesn't exist if A doesn't exist, I think is so critical to this. So this is one of the reasons why, like, I'm actually a big fan of regulation, right? Regulation to me, constrains certain futures and makes certain futures more possible, right? That's why it's a valuable intervention. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we say, oh, well, the answer is no technology or no policy or no whatever. It's like, no. These things all configure futures. They are valuable things to configure futures. But the thing is that they don't make inevitable futures. And so the thing that we have to do as we work together is to think about how all of the different moves that each of us make help work, like collide off of each other, making certain futures more probabilistically likely and less probabilistically likely. The danger, of course, is when you have a handful of players who can invest highly in really constraining the possible futures that are out there. And that is, of course, where we are at in the United States at this moment, right? Which is we're seeing a hand of actors who have a lot to gain at a very oligarchical sense, really playing towards an accelerationist future that is frankly about saving humanity without saving humans, which is terrifying. And so I want to look at those moments of like, what are the constraints that are being put onto things, and how do we not play into making certain futures that are really dangerous, really deadly, truly deadly? How do we restrict those futures as we also work to open up futures that are more equitable?